A grandfather sailed away from his 9-day-old granddaughter, promised he'd return in 3 months, and never saw her again for the rest of his life. This is not a legend. This is not some old fairy tale buried in a dusty textbook. This happened. In the summer of 1587, on a tiny island off the coast of what we now call North Carolina, 117 ordinary people stepped off 3 creaking wooden ships and into a nightmare that would swallow every single one of them whole. And the man who was supposed to protect them, he was forced to leave them behind. What happened next became the oldest unsolved mystery in American history. But before we get to the disappearance, you need to understand who these people were, because they weren't soldiers. They weren't criminals shipped off to some distant shore. They were families. Picture London in the winter of 1586. The streets are narrow and filthy. The air smells like coal smoke and horse dung. Most people will never travel more than 20 miles from the house where they were born. But in taverns and market squares, a wild rumor is spreading. Sir Walter Raleigh, one of the most famous men in England, a personal favorite of Queen Elizabeth, is recruiting volunteers for something unheard of. He wants to build an entire English city across the Atlantic Ocean, in a mysterious land the English are calling Virginia. He's calling it the City of Raleigh, and he's not looking for soldiers this time. He wants bakers, carpenters, farmers, bricklayers. He wants women and children. He wants families who are willing to give up everything, their homes, their savings, their entire lives, for a chance to own land in the New World. A man named John White signed up to lead them. He was around 47 years old, an artist by trade, a painter of maps and watercolors, who had already crossed the Atlantic twice on earlier scouting expeditions. Raleigh liked him, trusted him. On January 7, 1587, Raleigh officially named John White the governor of the new colony and handed him a corporate charter. White had no military training, no real leadership experience. But he was passionate, he was loyal, and he believed deeply that the English and the Native Americans could live side by side in peace. Over the next few months, White convinced 113 people to join the expedition. And among them were 2 people who meant more to him than anything else in the world. His daughter Eleanor, just 24 years old, and her husband Ananias Dare. Eleanor was pregnant. She was going to have her baby in the New World, thousands of miles from any midwife or doctor she had ever known. Think about that for a moment. A young woman carrying her first child, choosing to cross the Atlantic Ocean on a ship the size of a school bus. No antibiotics, no clean water, no guarantee she would survive the voyage, let alone the birth. That took a kind of courage most of us will never fully understand. They set sail from Plymouth, England in May 1587. 3 ships, 117 souls. The Atlantic crossing took 10 full weeks, 70 days on open water. The ships rolled and pitched through storms that sent barrels crashing across the decks. Salt water soaked into the food stores, turning bread to mush and meat rancid. Below deck, where the colonists slept in hammocks stacked 3 high, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and seasickness. Children whimpered in the dark. Grown men prayed out loud. And Eleanor Dare, her belly growing bigger by the week, endured every single mile of it. They were supposed to land at Chesapeake Bay. That was the plan from the very beginning. Chesapeake had deep harbors, rich soil, and the Native American tribes in that area had been relatively friendly to English scouts. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the only choice that made strategic sense. But when the ships reached the coast of Carolina in late July, everything changed because of one man. His name was Simon Fernandes. He was a Portuguese navigator, the pilot responsible for guiding the ships to their destination. And for reasons historians still argue about to this day, Fernandes refused to take the colonists any further. He told White that summer was running out. He wanted to get back to the business of raiding Spanish merchant ships, which was far more profitable than babysitting a group of settlers. He ordered every colonist off the ships at Roanoke Island, a place they were never supposed to settle, a place where an earlier English colony had already failed just 2 years before. White argued with him. He begged. But Fernandez had the crew on his side, and White had no power to overrule a ship's pilot at sea. So on July 22, 1587, the colonists were put ashore on Roanoke Island. They stood on that sandy beach with their trunks and their tools and watched the plan for their entire future collapse in a single afternoon. The island was not what they'd been promised. It was small, marshy. The old fort from the 1585 colony was falling apart. The buildings were rotting. Deer and wild animals had moved into the structures. Vines crawled up the walls. And worst of all, the ghost of the previous colony hung over everything. Those earlier English settlers, a group of about 100 soldiers under a man named Ralph Lane, had treated the local Native Americans terribly. They had kidnapped tribal leaders. They had demanded food at the point of a sword. And when they heard a rumor that the local chief was planning to cut off their food supply, they had killed him. That chief's people, the Roanoke and Secaucus tribes, had not forgotten. And now, standing on the same shore where their leader had been murdered, was a brand new group of English settlers. It didn't matter that John White wanted peace. It didn't matter that these were families, not soldiers. The damage had already been done by men who are long gone. 6 days after the colonists arrived, the consequences came crashing down. On July 28, 1587, a colonist named George Howe wandered away from the group. He was wading alone in the shallow water about 2 miles from the settlement, catching crabs for dinner. He had no weapon. He had no reason to think he was in danger. Members of the local Roanoke tribe found him there, alone and defenseless, and they killed him. It was not random. It was payback for everything the previous English settlers had done. The colony was barely a week old, and already someone was dead. John White panicked. He wanted to show strength, to prove the colonists could defend themselves. So he gathered a group of armed men and led a nighttime raid across the Sound to a village called Dasamongopunk, where he believed the attackers lived. They crept through the darkness, surrounded the sleeping village, and attacked at dawn. But they hit the wrong village. The people inside weren't enemies. They were members of the Croatoan tribe, the one group of Native Americans in the entire area who were actually friendly to the English. They had come to the village to gather leftover corn and fruit. White's men fired on them before realizing their mistake. It was a disaster. The one ally the colonists had was now wounded and angry, and questioning whether the English could ever be trusted. Now picture the situation. It's August 1587. You're standing on a tiny island in the middle of a sound. The nearest English settlement is 3,000 miles across an ocean. The local tribes either want you dead or have just been attacked by your own people by accident. You arrive too late to plant crops. Your food is running out. You have no military support, no backup plan, and a baby that could be born any day. And then, in the middle of all this fear and chaos, something happened that reminded everyone why they had come in the first place. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Virginia. Virginia Dare, the first English child ever born in the Americas. She was baptized on August 24th in a small ceremony on the island, only the second Christian baptism ever performed in the Virginia territory. The first had been Manteo, a Croatoan man who had been loyal to the English since 1585, and who John White had formally named the Lord of Roanoke, just 5 days before Virginia's birth. For a few short days, the mood on the island lifted. John White was a grandfather. Eleanor was a mother. Ananias Dare was a father. There was laughter again, and singing, and something that felt almost like hope. A baby's cry echoing across that swampy little island was proof that life could still begin, even in the worst of places. But the joy didn't last. It couldn't. The food was nearly gone. The colonists had no hunting grounds they could safely use. Fishing meant going to the water's edge, where George Howe had been killed just weeks before. And the biggest fear of all, winter, was only a few months away. If they didn't get help soon, they wouldn't survive it. So the colonists made a decision that would haunt the history books forever. They held a meeting, and they told John White that he had to go back to England. He was the only one with direct connections to Raleigh. He was the only one who could convince the Crown to send ships loaded with food, weapons, and reinforcements. He had to go. There was no other way. White fought it. He argued. He refused. His daughter had given birth 9 days ago. His granddaughter was not yet 2 weeks old. How could he leave them? He later wrote that he feared his enemies in England would slander him, would say he had abandoned the colony like a coward. And more than that, he was terrified, not of what people would say, but of what might happen to Eleanor and Virginia if he wasn't there to protect them. But the colonists wouldn't take no for an answer. They even put their request in writing, a formal document signed by the leading members of the colony, so that no one in England could accuse White of deserting his post. They told him this was the only way to save all of them. On August 27th, 1587, 9 days after Virginia Dare was born, John White walked to the shore of Roanoke Island and climbed into a small boat. The colonists stood along the water's edge and watched him go. Eleanor was there. Ananias was there. And somewhere, wrapped in cloth and cradled in her mother's arms, was a 9-day-old baby girl who would never know her grandfather's face. Before he left, they made a pact. If the colonists had to move while White was gone, they would carve their new location into a tree near the settlement. And if they were in danger, if they were forced to move against their will, they would carve a cross above the word. White nodded. He memorized the agreement, and then he sailed away. The voyage home nearly killed him. Storms tore at the ship for weeks. Disease swept through the crew. Fresh water ran dangerously low. White didn't reach land until October 16, 1587, when the battered ship finally limped into port in Ireland. He was exhausted. He was sick. But he was alive, and the clock was already ticking. Every day he spent away from Roanoke was another day his family was alone. He immediately began writing letters. He contacted Raleigh. He contacted merchants. He contacted anyone in London with a ship and a willingness to cross the Atlantic. He begged. He pleaded. He promised riches. He promised glory. He promised anything. And the answer, again and again, was the same. Not now. Not yet. Maybe later. 116 people were waiting on a tiny island across the ocean. Among them, a young mother and her baby girl. And the one man who had promised to save them was standing on a dock in England, watching empty harbors, waiting for a ship that never came. That is where part 1 ends. But what happened next? The pirate attack, the Spanish Armada, and the single most heartbreaking day in the history of American exploration. That story is even harder to hear. He arrived on her 3rd birthday, and she was already gone. In the winter of 1587, John White was one of the most desperate men in England. He had left 116 people on a tiny island across the Atlantic, including his own daughter Eleanor, her husband Ananias, and their newborn baby Virginia. He had promised to return with food, supplies, and reinforcements within months. But months turned into weeks of begging, weeks of closed doors, weeks of powerful men shaking their heads and saying the same thing. We don't have a ship. We can't spare the men. Come back later. By early 1588, White was running out of options. He had written to Sir Walter Raleigh. He had petitioned merchants. He had offered everything short of his own soul. And finally, after months of groveling, he managed to scrape together 2 ships, the Brave and the Roe. They were small, painfully small. Neither one was built for a transatlantic crossing. But they were all he had, and he loaded them with every barrel of food and every crate of supplies he could find. This was it. This was the rescue mission his family had been waiting for. They set sail in April 1588. For a few brief days, the wind was at their backs, and White must have felt something close to relief for the first time in months. His daughter was out there. His granddaughter was out there, and he was coming for them. Then the French pirates showed up. Somewhere in the open Atlantic, 2 enemy ships closed in on White's tiny fleet. They weren't interested in settlers or supplies. They were interested in anything they could steal. The pirates boarded the Brave, and what followed was a short, ugly fight that White never had a chance of winning. The pirates stripped both ships bare. They took every barrel of food, every weapon, every ounce of gunpowder, every piece of provision meant for the starving colonists on Roanoke Island. And during the chaos, a pirate shot John White in the side of his hip. He survived barely, but the wound was humiliating, and the loss was total. White and his shattered crew limped back to England with nothing. No food, no weapons, no way to reach his family. He had failed, and 116 people were still out there, waiting for a sail on the horizon that never appeared. But the worst part? The disaster wasn't over. It was just beginning. In the summer of 1588, King Philip II of Spain launched the most terrifying naval force the world had ever seen. 130 warships, the Spanish Armada, sailed north toward the English Channel with one purpose: to invade England and crush Queen Elizabeth's Protestant kingdom. The entire country went into a state of emergency. Elizabeth ordered every ship in England, no matter how small, no matter what it was doing, to prepare for war. Every single ship. That meant John White's rescue mission was dead. Not delayed, dead. There would be no voyage to Roanoke in 1588. There would be no voyage in 1589. The English Navy needed every hull, every sailor, every cannon. A handful of colonists stranded on an island 3,000 miles away was not a priority. The survival of England itself was at stake. So John White waited. And he waited. Month after month after month. Picture him in some cold London room, staring out a window at the Thames, knowing that across the ocean his daughter might be starving, his granddaughter might be sick. They might all be dead already. And there was absolutely nothing he could do about it, except wake up the next morning and write another letter that no one would answer. The Armada was defeated in August 1588. England celebrated, but the aftermath dragged on. Ships needed repairs. The treasury was drained. The country was still on high alert. And John White was still standing on the docks, waiting for anyone, to give him a ship. It took until March 20th, 1590, almost 3 full years after he had left Roanoke, for White to finally find passage across the Atlantic. And even then, it wasn't a rescue mission. A privateer named John Watts agreed to let White tag along on a raiding voyage to the Caribbean. The ships would stop at Roanoke on the way, but only briefly. This wasn't charity. White was a passenger, not a commander. He had no authority over the ships, the crew, or the schedule. They spent months raiding in the Caribbean before finally turning north toward the Outer Banks. White must have been losing his mind with impatience. Every day spent chasing Spanish prizes was another day his family was waiting. By the time the ships finally approached Roanoke Island, it was mid-August 1590, and then came the date that would become the most haunting detail in this entire story. August 18th, 1590, Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. As the ships anchored offshore that evening, White spotted something that made his breath catch. A column of smoke. A fire burning on the north end of Roanoke Island. Someone was out there. Someone was alive. White and a small landing party rowed toward the island through the darkness. They sounded a brass trumpet. They sang English songs, Familiar tunes, the kind of melodies that would carry across the water and tell anyone listening that friends had finally arrived. They called out names. They shouted into the black, Carolina night. Silence. Nothing came back but the sound of waves against the hull and wind through the trees. They waited until dawn. When the first gray light broke over the water, they rowed ashore and found the fire. It was just a wildfire. Rotting trees and dry brush, burning on their own. No one had set it. No one was tending it. It meant nothing at all. White pressed on anyway. He led his men south along the shore, past the marshes, and the sand flats, toward the spot where he had left the colony 3 years before. Every step must have felt heavier than the last. And when they finally reached the settlement, what they found was silence. The houses were gone. Not burned, not destroyed by a storm. They had been carefully taken apart, board by board, as if the colonists had dismantled them on purpose. In their place stood a tall palisade, a wall of thick tree trunks driven into the ground, with corners and flanking positions built like a small fort. Whoever built it had taken their time. This was not the work of people in a panic. White stepped through the entrance and looked around. Inside the palisade, iron bars lay scattered in the tall grass. 2 lead ingots, 4 iron cannons, heavy equipment, all of it abandoned, already half buried by weeds. He found the spot where his own personal trunks had been buried before he left, his maps, his paintings of the New World, his suits of armor. The trunks had been dug up and broken open. His paintings were ruined. His maps were gone. 3 years of rain and rot had destroyed nearly everything, but there were no bodies, no bones, no graves, no signs of struggle or fighting. Nothing to suggest that 116 people had died here. They were simply gone. And then he saw it. Carved into one of the main posts of the palisade, cut in large capital letters about 5 feet off the ground, was a single word, Croatoan. On a nearby tree, 3 more letters, C-R-O. As if someone had started carving the same word, but didn't finish. White's heart must have surged. Before he left in 1587, the colonists had agreed on a code. If they moved, they would carve the name of their destination. And if they were forced, they would carve a Maltese cross above the word to signal distress. There was no cross. No cross anywhere. Croatoan was the name of an island about 50 miles to the south. It was home to the Croatoan people, the same friendly tribe led by Manteo, the Native American man who had been loyal to the English since 1585, the man White himself had baptized and named Lord of Roanoke. If the colonists had gone anywhere, this was the place that made the most sense. White immediately begged the ship's captain to sail south to Croatoan Island, just 50 miles. A few hours of sailing. That's all he needed. That's all that stood between him and his family. The captain agreed. But the Atlantic Ocean had one last cruel card to play. That night, a massive storm rolled in off the coast. The winds picked up to near hurricane strength. The anchor cables snapped. The ships were dragged out to sea. By the time the crew regained control, they had lost most of their fresh water, 2 of their 3 anchors, and any realistic chance of returning to the shallow, dangerous waters around Croatoan Island. The captain made the call. They were going home. The mission was over. John White stood on the deck of that ship and watched the coastline of Carolina disappear over the horizon. His daughter was out there. His granddaughter, who had just turned 3, was out there, and the ocean was pulling him away from them for the last time. He never came back. He spent his remaining years on Raleigh's estates in Ireland, writing about what he called the evils and unfortunate events that had ruined his hopes. In February 1593, he wrote one final letter about his last voyage to Virginia. He died shortly after, probably that same year, still needing to believe, that Eleanor and Virginia were alive somewhere among the Croatoan people. So what actually happened to those 116 colonists? For 4 centuries, no one knew. But in recent decades, science has started filling in the silence. Tree ring studies from ancient bald cypress trees in Virginia revealed that between 1587 and 1589, the region experienced the most severe drought in 800 years. Crops would have withered. Streams would have dried up. Starvation wasn't just a risk. It was almost certain. Then came the archaeology. On Hatteras Island, the modern name for Croatoan Island, researchers from the University of Bristol found English artifacts inside a Native American village. A rapier handle, German pottery, a Nuremberg countercoin identical to ones found at the original Roanoke settlement. These were English belongings found in a Croatoan home, dating to the exact right time period. And 100 miles inland, at a site archaeologists call Site X in Bertie County, North Carolina, researchers found fragments of a rare English pottery called borderware, a type that existed only in the late 1500s. In 2012, when experts placed John White's own map under a special light at the British Museum, they discovered something hidden beneath a paper patch, the faint outline of a fort, drawn at the exact location of Site X. Someone, possibly White himself, had marked a backup location for the colonists and then covered it up. The picture that's emerging, piece by piece, is both simpler and more moving than any single dramatic ending. The colonists probably didn't perish in one catastrophe. They likely split apart. Some traveled south to Croatoan Island and joined Monteo's tribe, exactly what the carved word said. Others may have moved inland to Site X, seeking help from a friendly village called Metacum. Over the years, they may have married into the local communities. Their children would have spoken Algonquian. Their grandchildren might never have known a word of English. They didn't vanish into thin air. They were absorbed into a world that was already there. They survived the only way they could, by becoming part of something bigger than themselves. In 2005, the Lost Colony DNA Project began collecting genetic samples from families in eastern North Carolina, looking for traces of English DNA woven into Native American bloodlines. The work continues today. Every year, new clues surface. Every year, the silence gets a little less total. And there's one more thing this story gave the world. When the Jamestown settlers arrived in 1607, just 17 years later, and a short distance to the north, they carried the memory of Roanoke with them like a scar. They came better supplied, better organized, better armed. They knew what could go wrong because Roanoke had shown them. The Lost Colony's failure became the most important lesson in the history of English colonization. Every decision made at Jamestown was shaped by the ghosts of those 116 people who disappeared into the Carolina woods. John White never found his daughter. He never held his granddaughter again. But the word he found carved into that post, Croatoan, was never a mystery. It was an answer. It was a direction. It was 116 people saying, with the only tool they had left, we didn't give up. We moved. We adapted. We survived. And somewhere in the bloodlines of families living in eastern North Carolina today, those colonists may still be here, not lost at all, but woven so deeply into the fabric of this land that we just haven't learned to see them yet. Sometimes disappearing is just another word for becoming something new.